Daniel Hunt spent years building his peaceful farm, only to wake up one morning and find it razed to the ground by a fake HOA demanding fees he never owed. Behind it all was Roy Cassidy, a smug conman running a fraudulent scheme to steal land from unsuspecting owners. But Cassidy didn't realize one crucial thing. His latest victim wasn't just any farmer. He was a retired judge who knew exactly how to bring him down. And trust me, you won't believe how justice was served in the end. For Daniel Hunt, retirement had been a welcome retreat from the rigid formality of the courtroom. He had spent over 30 years as a county judge, ruling on cases that ranged from petty disputes to serious felonies, but the weight of justice had never truly left him at peace. The courtroom was filled with lies, deceit, and power plays. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, and by the time he stepped down, he was ready for something simpler, something real. That's why he had bought this land, a sprawling 20-acre farm just on the outskirts of a quiet Texas town, untouched by the bureaucracy and noise of the world he had left behind. It was his domain, a place where he could work with his hands instead of his mind, where the rhythm of nature dictated the rules rather than statutes and case law. His farm was his pride and joy. Unlike the mass-produced, pesticide-ridden crops sold in chain supermarkets, Daniel's produce was organic, meticulously cared for. He grew heirloom tomatoes, so plump and sweet they could be eaten straight off the vine, golden ears of corn that burst with flavor, fragrant lavender that filled the air with its calming scent. Neighbors often stopped by to buy from him directly, some even jokingly referring to his farm as Judge's Harvest. It was the kind of life that made him feel like he was finally building something instead of tearing things down. And so, like every morning, he followed the same routine. Wake up before the sun, brew a fresh cup of black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, step onto the front porch and take in the silence. But that morning, something wasn't right. Daniel stood there, his mug in hand, frowning. The air smelled different, like dust and gasoline, not damp earth and fresh crops. The usual chorus of birds was missing, replaced by something distant, mechanical. Then it came, a deep, guttural roar, shaking the ground beneath him. Engines, heavy machinery. A sinking feeling twisted in his gut. He moved down the steps, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The further he walked, the louder the noise became. Metal grinding, beeping, the unmistakable sound of destruction. His heartbeat quickened. His coffee was all but forgotten, cooling in his grip. And then he saw it. His land, his life's work, was gone. The lush green fields that had once stretched endlessly before him were now a graveyard of churned-up soil and scattered debris. His crops, which had been nearing peak harvest, were destroyed beyond recognition, ripped from their roots, their delicate stalks crushed under the weight of steel treads. A bulldozer sat idle in the center of the wreckage, its blades still caked in dirt and remnants of his farm. A handful of workers, clad in neon yellow vests, moved among the wreckage, chatting casually, as if they hadn't just erased months of effort, care, and patience. Daniel felt the breath punch out of his lungs. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. His mind refused to process the carnage before him. Then his eyes landed on it, the sign nailed to the wooden post at the entrance of his property. The bold block letters slammed into him like a freight train. Demolition carried out per HOA ordinance due to unpaid taxes. All inquiries should be directed to the board. HOA? Daniel's vision blurred, not from tears, but from rage creeping into his bloodstream. There was no homeowners association here. His farm was independent land, not part of some suburban development. He had never agreed to be a member of an HOA, never signed any contracts, never paid a single HOA fee in his life. So what the hell was this? His grip tightened around the coffee mug, his knuckles turning ghost white. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, the sound mixing with the distant rumble of the machines that had destroyed everything he had built. This wasn't a mistake. This was theft. His home, his sanctuary, had been raided like some lawless frontier. Someone had come onto his land and stolen from him. Not just property, but his effort, his time, his sweat and sacrifice. Daniel felt something dark and old stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. A burning, simmering anger that demanded justice. The legal system had always been his weapon of choice. But this was personal. And whoever had done this, they were about to learn that they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. The door to the so-called HOA office slammed open with a force that rattled the picture frames on the walls. The glass door bounced against the stopper, sending a sharp crack echoing through the quiet room. Heads turned. A receptionist, a young woman in a navy blue blazer, nearly dropped her phone as she looked up in alarm. Daniel Hunt stormed in, seething. His boots struck the polished tile floor with the weight of barely contained fury. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles taut and white, fingernails biting into his palms. His jaw was like granite, locked so tight that his molars ached. He had spent the last 2 hours digging through county records, cross-referencing property laws, and making phone calls to the local assessor's office. What he found only fueled his rage. The HOA that had leveled his farm, it didn't even exist a year ago. It was a sham, a recently incorporated organization set up by a group of land developers looking to claim independent properties under the pretense of unpaid fees. They had been targeting landowners on the outskirts of town, swooping in with fake regulations, slapping on fabricated tax penalties, and using legal intimidation tactics to force them into compliance, or drive them out. And now, Daniel Hunt was their latest victim, except they had no idea who they were dealing with. At the far end of the office, behind a sleek, modern mahogany desk, sat the man in charge, Roy Cassidy. He was everything Daniel had expected. Late 40s, expensively dressed in a tailored gray suit, the kind of man who exuded manufactured charm and unearned authority. His dark hair was slicked back, his manicured fingers shuffled through a stack of papers, and the smug grin on his face made Daniel's blood boil. As soon as Cassidy saw Daniel, his smirk widened. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, lacing his fingers behind his head like he had been expecting this moment all along. "Ah, Mr. Hunt," Cassidy drawled, unbothered, unfazed. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Daniel didn't waste time on pleasantries. He slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the desk with a force that made the penholder jump. "Your so-called rules don't exist," he growled, his voice low, controlled, but deadly. "I have every legal right to refuse membership in your organization. My property is not, nor has it ever been, part of your jurisdiction." Cassidy didn't even flinch. He sighed dramatically, flipping through the stack of papers like they were an old newspaper, then tossed them aside like they were meaningless. "Well, Mr. Hunt, I'm afraid it's a little late for that, isn't it?" Cassidy said, mock pity dripping from his words. He gestured toward the window, as if Daniel needed a reminder of what had already been done. "The land is cleared. No going back now. But hey, look at it this way. It's a fresh start." A fresh start. Daniel felt his pulse hammer in his ears. His farm wasn't just land. It wasn't just some real estate investment. It was his work, his labor, his home. They had stolen it from him, trampled it like it meant nothing. And now, this two-bit con man in a designer suit had the audacity to act like he was doing him a favor? Cassidy leaned forward, grinning. "Now, if you'd like, we can discuss your options." Daniel stared at him, expression unreadable. "Options," he repeated, voice dangerously calm. Cassidy nodded, eyes gleaming. "See, if you agree to officially join the HOA, we can offer you a nice discounted membership rate." His tone was slick, the tone of a man used to winning. "That way, you can develop the land properly, with our guidance, of course. You might even be able to get some assistance in rebuilding. Win-win, right?" Daniel's hands curled to fists. This wasn't an HOA, this was a shakedown, a calculated land grab wrapped up in bureaucratic red tape and manufactured legitimacy. They were parasites, using paperwork and intimidation instead of guns and threats. Cassidy chuckled, mistaking Daniel's silence for reluctance. "Look, Mr. Hunt," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I get it, change is hard. But fighting us, that's just a waste of time. You're not the first to come storming in here waving legal papers, and trust me, you won't be the last." He smirked. "But they all come around eventually, Tom." That was it. Daniel slowly exhaled, letting the silence stretch, letting Cassidy feel the weight of it. Then, with precise deliberation, he straightened his spine, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, and leaned down. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but razor sharp, each word a carefully aimed bullet. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Cassidy chuckled. "Oh, sure. You go ahead and do what you think you have to, Mr. Hunt." His grin widened. "Good luck in court." Daniel held his gaze, unblinking. Then he turned, walking out without another word. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. Cassidy laughed, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "These old-timers," he muttered, reaching for his pen. He had no idea. He had just declared war on the wrong man. The next morning, Daniel Hunt sat at his dining table. His kitchen turned into a makeshift war room. Stacks of legal documents, county law records, and property deeds were scattered across the table, each page another piece of ammunition, in the fight he was about to unleash. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, long gone cold, untouched as he pored over the evidence. His laptop screen glowed in the dim morning light, spreadsheets and case law references illuminating his stone-cold expression. He had spent the entire night digging, and what he had found was worse than he imagined. This wasn't just about him. This HOA wasn't a legitimate organization. It was a fraudulent scheme, a predatory operation designed to strip landowners of their property. They had targeted the elderly, the uninformed, the ones who wouldn't think to question an official-looking letter demanding overdue fees. Their method was simple and effective. Send a fake notice of unpaid HOA fees to property owners. 2. When they dispute it, hit them with legalese and intimidation tactics. 3. If they refuse to pay, fabricate a tax lien and order a demolition or seizure of their property. 4. Then, once the land was cleared, sell it to developers at a massive profit. It was a well-oiled machine, and they had been getting away with it for years, until now. Daniel's hands curled into fists as he stared at the evidence before him. He could hear Roy Cassidy's smug voice in his head. "You're not the first to come storming in here waving legal papers, and trust me, you won't be the last." Daniel's jaw tightened. No, he wasn't going to be just another name on their list of victims. He was going to bury them. The lawsuit. Within hours, Daniel had filed a lawsuit against the fraudulent HOA, citing illegal property seizure, destruction of private property, fraud, and extortion. His name alone was enough to make the courthouse buzz. Judge Hunt was back, and this time, he wasn't just presiding over justice. He was delivering it himself. But he didn't stop at his case. Using the network of lawyers, law clerks, and legal analysts he had built over decades, he uncovered more victims: farmers, retirees, widows, people who had lost their homes and land to the scam. He made phone calls to old colleagues, spoke with state officials, and within 24 hours, a full-scale investigation had begun. The HOA's paper-thin legitimacy crumbled under scrutiny. Their legal documents were riddled with forgeries, their tax claims fabricated. Bank records showed kickbacks from developers, and witness testimonies piled up. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was a criminal case. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome had been decided long before the final gavel fell. The courtroom was a battleground of evidence, testimonies, and damning financial records. Every witness, every cross-examination, every newly unearthed document further tightened the noose around Roy Cassidy's neck. His once unshakable confidence had crumbled early in the proceedings, and by the time the final week arrived, he looked like a man drowning in his own lies. The fraud was undeniable. The fake HOA, the fabricated tax liens, the coerced property seizures. It was a carefully orchestrated scam that had ruined lives and stolen land from rightful owners. And now, justice was coming down like a hammer. Daniel watched as each victim took the stand: a retired veteran who had lost his ranch, an elderly widow who had been forced out of her home, a young couple who had spent their life savings building a future only to have it bulldozed into the dirt. Their voices carried weight. Their stories painted the truth. And when it was time for Cassidy himself to take the stand, he had nothing left to say. No smirks, no quips, just a broken man, his once tailored suit now wrinkled, his slicked back hair now unkempt, his hands trembling as he tried to offer weak excuses. The judge, not Daniel, but an old colleague of his, a man who had no patience for crooks like Cassidy, didn't even let him finish. And when the verdict came down, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, illegal property seizure, extortion, destruction of private property. The sentence was 15 years in federal prison. The fake HOA was dissolved. All its assets were frozen, and the illegally collected funds were redistributed to compensate every victim. Some would get their land back. Others, whose property had been sold off or irreparably damaged, would be paid every cent they were owed, and then some. As Roy Cassidy was led away in cuffs, Daniel remained still, watching as the man who had once laughed in his face now stared at the floor, too ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. It was over. Rebuilding what was stolen, Daniel returned to his land on a quiet morning, much like the one when this nightmare had begun. But this time there were no bulldozers, no strangers in yellow vests, no destruction. Only him and the land that had been his all along. The soil was still scarred, the remains of his old crops long since buried beneath layers of churned-up earth. Rebuilding wouldn't be easy. It would take months, maybe years, to return the farm to what it once was. But Daniel had time. He wasn't doing this for profit or status. He was doing it because this land was his, and no amount of greed, corruption, or deceit could ever take it away from him again. With a steady hand, he drove a wooden post deep into the ground at the farm's entrance. A freshly painted metal sign gleamed in the Texas sun, its message clear and final. Private property. No trespassing. Daniel took a step back, surveying his work. A slow breath left his lungs, the tension of the past few weeks finally uncoiling. For the first time in a long time, he felt peaceful. Some men believe they can cheat the law. They bend the rules, manipulate the system, take what isn't theirs, all while thinking there will be no consequences. But eventually, the law catches up to them, and sometimes the law doesn't knock on their door, it kicks it down. The courtroom showdown. It all moved fast. By the end of the week, the case was set for an emergency hearing. Daniel arrived early that morning, his suit pressed, his tie perfectly knotted, his face calm, unreadable. He took his seat at the judge's bench, his rightful place, flipping through the thick case file in front of him. Then the doors swung open. Roy Cassidy walked in. For the first time, the man who had been so smug, so confident, looked off balance. His sharp suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted across the room as if looking for an escape. And then he saw Daniel, sitting not in the plaintiff's seat, not on the other side of the courtroom, but behind the bench, the judge's seat. Cassidy's face drained of color, his breath hitched, his confidence fracturing before the entire courtroom. Daniel let the silence stretch, watching the realization sink in. Then he lifted his hand and tapped his pen against the desk. 1, 2, 3 measured beats, the sound cutting through the thick tension like a hammer to glass. Then he spoke, voice calm, steady, absolute. "Welcome to my courtroom, Mr. Cassidy." A pause. "Let's see what we have here, shall we?" Cassidy stumbled back a step, his lawyers whispering frantically at his side. He wasn't just in trouble, he was already trapped, and Daniel Hunt was about to tear him apart.